USS Franklin was a product of World War II. She was laid down on the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and her keel was being laid when the major carrier battles of Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had already been fought. As a fairly large Essex-class fleet carrier, even the industrial might of Newport News shipbuilding took a little bit of time to get her ready, and so she was launched in October 1943, and then rapidly commissioned by the end of January 1944. However, it is notable that HMS Dreadnought, which is remarked upon for the rapidity of her construction at the time, went from keel to commission in 15 months, whilst Franklin, which displaced somewhat more, managed the same feat at about 14 months. It then took another 5 months for her to actually see combat. This was split between a shakedown cruise, embarking her air group, and then actually having to get physically from the east coast of the USA to the western Pacific, as by this stage of the war, the front line was somewhere in the region of the Marianas Islands. Summer 1944 thus consisted of a series of strike missions, voyages to refuel and rearm, and then repeating the process. This would continue on into the autumn, but during this period there were both highs and lows. The highs included her air group helping to sink the giant battleship Musashi at the Battle of Sibuyan Sea, before she was ordered north with the rest of the carriers for the Battle of Cape Engano, where her aircraft scored some more hits on Admiral Ozawa's ships, although this little sideshow denied her pilots a crack at the Yamato. But the lows included 2 separate hits from enemy aircraft. On the 15th of September, 3 aircraft managed to score a single bomb hit on the edge of the deck edge elevator, the other 2 being shot down, which caused 25 casualties, 3 of them fatal. More seriously, on the 30th of October, one of the first kamikaze attacks managed to score a hit on the ship, the aircraft smashing through the flight deck and exploding inside the ship, killing 56 and wounding 60 more. It took just over an hour to extinguish the flames and temporarily patch the flight deck so that her aircraft could return, but after temporary repairs the ship was sent back for more complete repairs in the continental United States. This also saw a change of command from the relatively popular Captain Shoemaker to the somewhat less popular Captain Guerres. With repairs completed in February 1945, Franklin headed back out to sea, and by mid-March she was back on station with other ships of Task Force 58. 4 days later, on the 19th, she would have her date with Destiny. Dawn of the 19th found the carrier within 50 miles of the Japanese coastline. Launching a first-wave strike just before 0600, the ship was then set at a modified version of Condition Zebra, with all passageways and compartments sealed, but with a portion of the crew able to stand down. A second wave of aircraft was due to leave starting at about 0700, and the day continued on with very little on the radar screens. It was almost inconceivable to those who'd been in the Navy since the start of the war that just over 3 years later, they were about 2 hours easy cruising from the enemy coast, and it could almost have been a training exercise. There were 31 aircraft of all types spotted for the second wave, and those that launched first were already circling, waiting for the rest. 22 aircraft remained below in the hangar, mostly fighters, although some of them had been armed and fueled and were waiting to be put up on deck to launch with the rest of the second wave. The rest of the ship's complement had gone off in the first wave. The day was calm, with low scattered clouds. Then a notification came over the voice radio that the carrier Hancock had spotted a single twin-engined enemy aircraft somewhere in the area. Franklin's radar picked up an unknown contact that was circling about 10 miles away, but it was scattered in amongst a bunch of other US Navy verified contacts. So possibly it could have just been another US aircraft with its IFF not working. But something about the motion seemed slightly off. It matched maybe a recon aircraft? If it was, it would probably be a combat type that had been repurposed for the role, as a flying boat or a seaplane, the typical Japanese recon aircraft of the early war, would have known quite well they didn't stand a chance of outrunning a combat air patrol at that kind of distance. But a lightly loaded fighter or one of the newer attack aircraft like a B-7A Grace or a D-4Y Judy could, if they entered a shallow dive and opened up the taps, retain enough of a lead to make it back over Japanese soil if they spotted the Hellcats and Corsairs that were coming after them in time. Admittedly, this was only one aircraft, but the anti-aircraft guns were warmed up just in case. But then the contact faded away. Either it had gone home if it was hostile, or it actually had been a friendly contact, just again with its IFF not working. Or perhaps it had never really been there at all. Early radar did sometimes give some odd false contacts. Unknown to many at the time, the US carriers at this stage were largely blind on their port quarter whilst they were in the process of launching airstrikes, as the radar interfered with the onboard aircraft's IFF systems, and to aim the search radar across the deck would overload said search radar with an exponential number of very happy IFF squawks coming from a few dozen yards away. The Japanese, however, had figured this out, and it's possible that this played a role in what was to come. 8 minutes later, at 0708, a D4Y Judy duly dropped out of the clouds at less than 2,000 feet in altitude, already on an attack run. It was barely 1,000 yards ahead of the carrier, which meant that even at the most optimistic of slow speeds, the crew had less than 10 seconds before the aircraft would be directly overhead, and most likely, much less. And less still before the attacker actually dropped its bombs, living up to its Japanese designation of Susei, which means comet or meteor. Still, at least one of the 5-inch 38 gun mounts managed, operating under automatic radar control, to get a shot or two off, but the shells went hopelessly wide as the gun mount had not had enough time to slew fully into position. The Japanese aircraft shot past, a little bit to the pilot's left, and it would have clipped the radar mast on its way by, so low had it managed to get, but those who saw it pass overhead were unable to track it any further, as a moment later there was a pair of massive explosions as the two 550-pound bombs it has been carrying hit and went off. The pilot of the D4Y could not have timed his attack run better or placed his bombs in better locations if he'd tried 100 repeat runs. About the only thing that could have been worse would have been if he'd dropped a single heavier, true armour-piercing bomb, but as it was, the first semi-armour-piercing bomb landed almost exactly on the centre line of the flight deck, about level with the back of the first 5-inch 38 mount. Coming in at a shallow angle of around 30 degrees, it punched through the flight deck and continued onwards through the hangar, then exploded at around frame 87, possibly after bouncing off the hangar deck's armour plate. This explosion was roughly level with the ship's island and the deck edge elevator, if you're looking at the ship from front to back. It detonated amongst Corsairs that were loaded, fueled, and awaiting a trip up to the flight deck. The second bomb hit aft, right amongst the aircraft gathered on the flight deck itself. This one also punched through the flight deck, but it detonated a fraction earlier, midway between the flight and hangar decks, possibly because it struck an aircraft on its way down and this had initiated the fuse a fraction of a second earlier than its compatriot, or possibly it was a general purpose rather than a semi-armour piercing bomb. Sources vary. Directly beneath it, however, were even more aircraft, bombs, and Tiny Tim rockets. But a few feet above it, of course, were the massed aircraft of the second strike who were waiting their turn to launch. Within moments, hundreds of men had been knocked flat by the double explosions, dozens had been killed instantly, and then everything caught fire. Aft, more than 36,000 gallons of aviation fuel began pouring into the hangar, from ruptured tanks of the aircraft below, the primed fueling systems, and some of the strike wave above, and this almost immediately ignited. Forward, the shockwave and fragments of the bomb's explosions ricocheted off of the mostly intact armour of the hangar deck. There was a small hole, but nothing close to large enough to dissipate the effects all that much, and then shot back up, chasing the initial shrapnel and shockwave from the bomb that had headed upwards in the first place. In this area, above the hangar deck level, were semi-suspended cabins that contained things like the Combat Information Centre, the air plot, pilot briefing and ready rooms, and other such areas that were crowded with people. Being essentially unarmoured, the men in these areas and the lower levels of the ship's island were first catapulted into the ceiling as the decks beneath them heaved up, many with broken legs, as the floor was punched clean upwards by the twin shockwaves. Only those who were lucky enough to be in or near hatchways, or the more rigid bulkheads, were spared this fate. Then there was a hail of red-hot shrapnel, which just grew in number as it smashed through things and then took those smashed things with it, And then, assuming anyone was left after that, there was the roar of combusting aviation fuel and the battering ram of superheated air and smoke that came in front of it. It was then up to the small number of survivors who were still mobile to try and work out how to get out of there with as many of their injured crewmates as had survived before the bombs and rockets below started going off. Only one man made it out of the Combat Information Centre. He, for some reason, had been wearing his steel helmet, which meant that everyone else had been killed instantly when the deck heaved up and smashed them all headfirst into the ceiling, whereas his helmet took the worst of the blow and left him just slightly dazed. A few stunned survivors tried to grab hoses as the fireball roared down the length of the hangar towards the bow, but power to the pumps was already knocked out and there was nothing they could do but duck or run. Others, especially deck crew and a few lucky men from the aft of the hangar, had already been blown over the side. The aircraft on the flight deck were mostly still not on fire in the few seconds after the explosions, although they were damaged, and pilots and crew were scrambling to get out whilst others were heading back into the massive aircraft to try and shut down still running engines and disarm some of the weaponry. A few, with the presence of mind to do so, were also grabbing life rafts from inside the aircraft and throwing them overboard after the men who'd been blown into the water. There had been a line of men in the aft part of the hangar who were waiting to get to the mess, and most of them had been wiped out instantly by the blast as well. Back up above, the seconds after the blast had men also trying to work out what happened. One helldiver had been on its takeoff run. The next thing the pilot knew, he was upside down and then was unceremoniously dumped on his head when he released his harness straps. But then the heat and damage reached the jumbled mass of aircraft, and the whoosh of igniting fuel tanks and the roar of burning munitions sent the first of many fireballs into the sky. One pilot reached relative safety, forward on the flight deck, only to hear a rocket ignite behind him, shoot off its wing mount and roar straight over his head, leaving him with minor flash burns. The ship now faced a terrible choice as flames and smoke engulfed the entire aft section. As the smoke and fire built second by second, it was clear that they had to change course, or else the wind would fan the flames to the maximum extent. A turn to starboard almost led to a collision with the USS Bataan and sent thick smoke pouring over the island. A turn to port then sent the smoke away over the port side and allowed the gathering damage control crews to advance, but unfortunately this also put the ship on a direct course for the Japanese coast. Nearby escorts began to alter course to try and assist, the destroyer Hickox making its way up from the stern and picking up men in the water on the way. Others were now voluntarily entering the sea as smoke and rising heat forced them out of the ship, onto the gangways, and then, as even these grew untenable, over the side. Thus far, the armour plate of the hangar deck had kept most of the damage from reaching further below, and that would change as time passed. Only minutes had gone by since the bombs had hit, but the crew were already rallying, trying to find out which pumps and hoses were not actively on fire and also had both power and water supplies. Whilst they were trying to do this, they had to be ready to play a game of dodgeball with explosives, as at any moment tiny Tim rockets were igniting and streaking out in all directions. Another explosion sent over 2,000 pounds of double wasp engine flying so high into the air that those who were trying to keep track of it to avoid its inevitable return thanks to gravity lost sight of it as it became too small to see. The ship had almost instantly been effectively cut into three: the island and the forward part of the flight deck, the machinery and spaces and the magazines, and the absolute aft end of the ship below the hangar deck level, which included aft steering. Everything else was either on fire, too hot or too smoke-filled to inhabit, or was heading that way pretty quickly. The only communication method left intact between these areas consisted of two sound-powered phone lines, one of which ran from the bridge to the aft steering compartment, and another ran from that steering compartment to the machinery spaces. Everything else had either been destroyed or was out of power. Some men were trapped in compartments that were cut off from the rest of the ship, their most obvious routes of escape severed. For some, this was a chance for those who knew the ship like the back of their hand to lead their fellows on circuitous routes to safety. For others, the only choice was to wrap wet blankets around their faces and dare a run through the blazing corridors. For still others, it was a waiting game, sealing themselves inside, or having already been involuntarily sealed in by bulkhead distortion, and hoping that the air supply and heat levels remained reasonable enough to let them last until relief or rescue would come. Unfortunately for many others, it turned out to be a race between rising heat and falling oxygen to see which got them first. The bombs were the next thing to go. Some of them just burned. In others, the explosive filler material melted and ran out over the decks. In others still, partial explosions scattered debris but did little else. But some went off with full force, fanning the flames and sending burning wreckage in all directions. These explosions sent still more men careening overboard. At least 2 bombs were seen to be blown up into the sky by the explosions occurring around them, arm themselves mid-flight, and then explode once they fell back onto the ship. As the flight deck began to disintegrate, burning aircraft fell back into the hangar, and the fires above spread further and further forward, eating into the aft end of the island. Whilst the tiny Tims on deck had flung themselves off in various directions, miraculously not hitting anything, the ones in the hangar had nowhere to go, and these caused even more damage below. Worst of all, they ruptured the air intakes and uptakes for the machinery spaces, almost immediately knocking out number 1 boiler room with the force of the explosions, whilst the other machinery spaces had to deal with an inrush of thick smoke and heat, which could be temporarily dealt with using gas masks and damage control rebreathers, but others had to deal with infalls of burning aviation fuel, which was somewhat less easy to manage, and they all had to suddenly deal with the loss of air pressure, which reduced the efficiency of the boilers. Just at the moment the ship needed all the power it could get, the machinery was starting to die. The destroyer USS Miller now came alongside and began playing her own fire hoses on the Inferno at roughly the same time as a mixture of portable pumps and generators, plus some rapid rerouting of what was left of the ship's available power, got some of the hoses on the forecastle working, and the surviving crew were able to start a more concerted fight back against the advancing flames, in amongst having to keep an eye on detonating ammunition as 50 cal and 30 cal rounds began spitting around the ship. Some of the rounds were traitor, so at least you knew where those were going. More worrying were the ones that you couldn't see. The Miller was ordered alongside to take off the Admiral and his staff. This they did even whilst the crew kept up their part in hosing down the ship. Although the fires had been slowed in their progress towards the bow, they were still advancing. Groups of men fought back against the fires in various sections of the ship as best they could until their rebreathers ran out or their hoses and portable firefighting units expired. Then they were forced to go over the side or over the stern. Others, without that chance, were seen to be fighting to the very end before being consumed by the flames. Up on deck, explosions from more detonating ammunition forced the damage control crews back and fanned the flames still further almost every time it seemed they were beginning to make progress. As the heat and smoke increased, dozens of men were being dragged unconscious from the machinery spaces every minute, and eventually Boiler Room 1 fell silent. Then the heat began to rupture steam lines, and gradually rooms 3 and 4 went offline as well. By 10:00 in the morning, the ship was dead in the water. A single diesel generator was all that was powering the main effort on the forward part of the flight deck. Now portable pumps and generators were themselves beginning to run low on fuel, rebreather masks were running out of air, and with the hoses dying one by one, the flames were back on the move. The magazines had been ordered flooded, but with all the accessible valves connected to broken mains, if the fires kept going, the ship was likely to explode completely. Fortunately, at this stage, the Hickoks had managed to get right up to the Franklin's stern and begun ferrying men off of the lower aft fantail, adding her own hoses to the mix. The light cruiser Santa Fe also made her way alongside and threw in her efforts, although the explosion of the ready service magazine in the aft 5-inch 38 mount aboard the carrier shredded most of the cruiser's hoses that were above deck. Somehow, the debris managed to miss everyone involved, and new hoses were ordered to be brought up, but in the interim Santa Fe was forced to back off to reconsider. But the efforts had brought the Franklin's crew precious breathing room, and the last remaining damage control equipment was sourced, swapped out for stuff that had broken, and the fight began anew. Santa Fe's captain was now faced with a choice: as still more ordnance exploded aboard the stricken carrier. If he decided to go back in, he knew he risked the fate of the USS Birmingham, which had been alongside the much smaller carrier USS Princeton when it exploded. That explosion had wiped out a good chunk of the cruiser's own crew, who'd been on deck trying to help out. On the other hand, if he kept his station where he was, it just meant the ever more listing carrier was giving him a ringside seat to the deaths of dozens of brave men every minute. Coming to a decision, the cruiser swung away and then accelerated to 25 knots, coming back around and steaming for the Franklin on a collision course. With brilliant seamanship, the cruiser's crew conspired to back the engines, put the rudder over hard to starboard, and end up running their ship right alongside the carrier, shearing along the gallery deck and knocking off everything but the hull plating. This locked the cruiser alongside Franklin. Now that their fates were tied to one another, the evacuation of the trapped and the wounded could accelerate, as men could just step or be carried from one ship to the other without the encumbrance of transfer lines. One of the luckiest men alive was Lieutenant Commander MacGregor Kilpatrick, commanding officer of VF-5, the ship's fighter unit. He had accidentally stepped onto a supply elevator that was running between the flight deck and the hangar a few moments before the bombs hit. The elevator had been on its way down into the hangar at the time, and when the explosions occurred, it fell into the Inferno. And between this and the fact that it had been almost exactly at the same level as the bombs when they went off, it was assumed that he'd been killed instantly. But around this time, several hours after the detonations, he popped back up out of the aft end of the island, blinked, looked around, and joined a firefighting team, offering no word as to quite how he'd survived the past few hours down in an inferno that was so intense it was making some of the hull plates glow. As a valuable aviator, however, he was rapidly ordered off the ship and onto the Santa Fe, albeit under his very loud protests. Another advantage of the re-arrival of the Santa Fe was that the cruiser's crew were rapidly stripping their own ship of medical supplies, hoses, generators, pumps, food, rebreathers, fresh water, and other useful things, which they then brought aboard the carrier to help supplement the dwindling supplies of the crew who were left on the Franklin. The cruiser Pittsburgh now showed up to help, joining Hickox and Miller aft to fight the fires and take off even more men. Captain Fitz of the Santa Fe would, rather understandably, receive the Navy Cross for his actions. Ironically, the water that was being sent into the ship from all corners was now causing issues of its own. As it percolated down through the holes and the shattered hatches, it gathered deep in the ship and began to increase the carrier's list. Now, some of the pumps were doing double duty, sending water up to smother the flames, but also pumping much of that same water, a few minutes later, overboard to stop the ship from capsizing. But at this stage, now just after lunch, the fight against the flames, whilst not over, was certainly on the front foot, and expeditions were being made into formerly trapped parts of the ship to free crew where possible, many of whom would then join the firefighting efforts. On the other hand, deep inside the ship, Lieutenant Junior Grade Don Gary was trapped with 300 other men in the aft mess deck. Somehow sensing a lessening of the heat, he took a nearly used rebreather with only 10 minutes of oxygen remaining and set off on a one-man journey into the bowels of the ship. He was on the third deck, and everything around him was smoke, and beyond that, fire. So, between the loss of power and the smoke, he decided it was impossible to see, and all the possible routes away seemed to result in a horrible burning death anyway, so he headed down onto the fourth deck. Then, making his way along, he eventually found an uptake shaft which happened to have a ladder inside it. This shaft led up to the flight deck in an area that was not on fire. Taking a few breaths and finding someone to replace his rebreather canister, he then went back inside, retraced his steps, and led 10 men out of the mess hall, the volunteers wearing soaked rags to account for the smoke. Somewhat like a mother shrew, he guided the column of men with linked hands on their 600-foot route to safety. Leaving them on deck, he popped back down again, and this time emerged with 50 more. Emboldened and seeing that he still had some time left on his rebreather canister, he dropped back into the soot and darkness for a third time and popped up some time thereafter with the other 240-odd men, all forming a conga line. This now done, he found a path into the hangar, where firefighting teams were finally being able to make some progress. He joined them for a bit, until he recognised a hatch that led down to the machinery spaces. He then braved the heat and smoke another time, now helping a team that was heading down to relight number 5 boiler in the 3rd boiler room, which restored power to much of the ship. Somewhat unsurprisingly, he would be awarded a very well-deserved Medal of Honour. Up on the forward part of the flight deck, the ship's chaplain, Father O'Callaghan, had been tirelessly organising the firefighting parties and helping the injured. Some of the crew were catching the hot, loose bombs that were still rolling around and seeing them off the side of the ship. He was then told of a problem. The flames had been beaten back from the forward 5-inch 38 mounts, but the latent heat that the metal had absorbed was still there, and this was slowly cooking the ammunition. The aftmost mount had already gone up, as we'd described, when Santa Fe was alongside the first time. This one exploding could undo all the progress that had been made. A chain gang was needed to pass the hot 5-inch ammunition from the ready magazine out and throw it overboard. Although he was a sufferer of claustrophobia, O'Callaghan rounded up a party of men and led the way, fighting off the combination of heat, smoke, and the cold sweat of fear. One of the men who came into the room with him tried to lighten the mood by quipping, "Praise the Lord and dump the ammunition." The men all ended up with blistered hands, but their actions probably saved the ship. As the flames were pushed back still further, more superheated but somehow unexploded bombs were found, and soon dedicated parties were set up so that, when one was located, a jet of cold water could be sprayed on it to cool it, whilst keeping the water away from the spinner on the front of the arming device on the nose, until the bomb was cool enough to be manhandled over the side. O'Callaghan, for this and many other actions, would also receive the Medal of Honour, albeit it would take some time. Then gunfire erupted. The destroyers Hunt, Marshall and Tingy were circling nearby, picking up survivors in the water and running escort, and they, along with the Pittsburgh, had noticed additional Japanese aircraft closing in. Again, lone D4Y duties. One of them even got close enough to drop its bomb, but luckily this landed slightly short. It, and another aircraft like it, were both soon shot down. A reconnaissance aircraft that showed up an hour later would meet a similar fate. The cruiser Pittsburgh was the largest ship present that wasn't Franklin, and so she took the carrier under tow. This allowed Santa Fe to break off, but not before the crew of Franklin had to manhandle the heavy tow line aboard and set it up, since all the machinery forward, including the capstan, was broken or without power, the limited amount of power being understandably devoted to the pumps and hoses. The poor men in the aft steering compartment had been being slowly cooked for 7 hours, as the armour around their position had first absorbed the heat from the surrounding fires, but then radiated it into their compartment for several hours more. But at a call from the bridge, they rallied to adjust the ship's rudder to match the new course that Pittsburgh was trying to haul them on, away from the Japanese coast, and more parties were heading down into more of the machinery spaces to see what else could be restarted. At this stage, there was something of an odd balance of men. About 1,100 of the crew were now aboard various destroyers and cruisers, most of them on the Santa Fe. Over 800 had died aboard Franklin, and almost 300 more who were still aboard were wounded. That left a total of about 700 still alive aboard the ship, but as just indicated, most of them were not in a fit state to do anything but lie down. The remaining crew, about 400 to 500, were left to contribute to the ship's ongoing survival efforts in some way, out of a crew that had numbered almost 3,000 a few hours earlier. By 1700, the fires had been contained aft of the number 3 elevator, or what was left of it, but it was clear that the fires, at least on the outside, needed to be out soon. Otherwise, the ship would be an easy target for night-flying Japanese aircraft. Work began in the machinery spaces in earnest around 2100, and by midnight Boiler Room 3 was online and the turbines began to spin up. By dawn, with more boilers lit, the ship was moving under her own power, although the tow was not cast off, as it was helping maintain course and keep the ship's speed up. Counterflooding was now attempted, but since they only had manual valves, and no communication, since again all the electrical systems were offline and the central damage control station had to be evacuated, they actually counterflighted a bit too enthusiastically, and the ship went from having a 13 to 16 degree list to starboard to a 9 degree list to port. But it was better than nothing. By 1000 hours on the 20th, the ship was now able to make 15 knots, and the tow would be cast off around about noon. Not all the fires were out, but the largest ones had been finished off, and work was able to start on restoring what systems they could, whilst the last few fires were suppressed. They also had to gather the bodies of the fallen, reopen sealed parts of the ship, and other kinds of rather grim tasks. Further Japanese aircraft now pursued the ship in a last-ditch effort to finish it off, but despite a large formation of about 4 dozen heading in, they were all beaten off or shot down without scoring any direct hits. This included a large formation of twin-engine bombers carrying the Oka suicide rockets. The ship now gradually limped its way home, although the tale of her survival was almost ruined by the captain, who now decided that everyone who'd left the ship during the attack and been picked up was required to explain themselves in full in writing, or he would charge them with desertion, or he might do that anyway. A number of rescue ships simply ignored his communications. The ship reached Ulithi, and then after some time patching up the worst damage that could be fixed there and getting some of the unexploded ordnance dealt with, the ship staged on to Pearl Harbor. Here the captain managed to make himself even less popular by insisting on taking the ship in himself and promptly crashing it into the pier at high speed. After that, it was on to Brooklyn Navy Yard for full repairs, passing through the Panama Canal along the way. Sadly, the captain here began to actually work up full desertion charges against many of the crew, to the dismay of pretty much everyone except himself. Luckily, one quick-thinking lawyer, finding himself deluged by requests for defence lawyer work, now discovered that he was in an officers' club with a number of very senior US officers, as well as quite a few from Franklin. He pointed out loudly that if the junior officers were to be charged with deserting the ship, then they would be in good company, as apart from those who'd been blown over the side by the initial explosion, Admiral Davison had been the first man to leave the ship, heading for the destroyer USS Miller, followed immediately by his staff. This was legally a very tenuous argument, as the Admiral leaving a stricken ship was standard US Navy procedure, but from a PR perspective it was absolutely explosive. In part thanks to this, as well as the general absurdity of charging men with desertion for being thrown overboard by exploding ordnance, the charges would eventually be dropped. Although he would be awarded a Navy Cross for saving the ship, Captain Guejeres would be relieved of command in July 1945 and was never put in charge of another US Navy vessel. Franklin herself was gradually repaired to an as-new condition, although her crew were largely redistributed across the fleet. But soon after the war, Franklin was then decommissioned again and placed into storage along with USS Bunker Hill. Kept around for a theoretical ultimate upgrade of the Essex class, as she was almost factory fresh, neither ship would actually see active service again, as by the time such an upgrade could plausibly have been decided upon, there were far larger and more capable carriers in service, and the latest naval aircraft had grown beyond the capacity of the Essex class to operate, even with upgrades and refits. And so Franklin would be sold for scrap in 1966.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.